Good afternoon folks, and welcome to Waves World. After this video, please like, share it and comment if you wish, and perhaps give me some suggestions in terms of which videos that you would like me to concentrate on going forward. I would like to have a look at the development and progress of the Afrikaner as a white ethnic group in South Africa and how they came about to be called the Afrikaner. I wish to start this video by viewing the emergence, development and establishment of the Afrikaner and the impact on South Africa through a psycho-historical lens, which is not often done. And at the same time define a few historical markers interspersed with my observations and my personal perspective. So let's start with the very famous American philosopher and sociologist called B.F. Skinner, lived from 1904 to 1990, also an author of course, and perhaps one of the most influential American psychologists and a modern behaviorist along the lines of Pavlov. He developed a theory called operant conditioning. The idea that behavior is determined by its consequences, be they reinforcements or punishments, which makes it more or less likely that the behavior will occur again. Now this is the nearest to a scientific explanation of what we often refer to as a self-fulfilling prophecy I've ever encountered on a personal level. Okay, let me explain. You believe a person or group to be less human than you because of your social conditioning, your socialization, and in effect your brainwashing, right? You force them into an artificial environment that promotes and enables their dehumanization and oppression, which in turn cultivates distrust, resentment, and hatred of you. Consequently, this manufactured environment contributes to a culture of self-loathing, self-hatred, and extreme suspicion towards you. And of course to people that look like you. Now on contact with that person, and on cue, you immediately treat them. Now please listen very carefully. You immediately treat them as per the mental script doctored into your subconscious. In other words, you treat them as less than human, like how you would view a subspecies or vermin. Your treatment borders on cruel, even torture-like in its application. Naturally, the person's fight or flight defenses kicks in and they display apathy, resentment, and even hatred towards you because of the dual effects of their social conditioning, your socialization, and your inhumane treatment of them. Finally, at the end of their own psychological tolerances for mistreatment and abuse, they react in the same way towards you as your destructive, inhuman treatment of them. At that point you exclaim, see, that they can't be trusted because they hate us for no reason. Thus your prophecies of those people are not unsurprisingly, or rather not surprisingly, fulfilled. Operant conditioning, in my view, is one of the socio-psychological cornerstones of racism and its continuing successes today, in spite of there being absolutely no scientific rationale, no empirical evidences to confirm or validate its veracity. In simple terms, this means that a perfectly intelligent person will hold on to a silly superstition, an irrational fear, or discredited thought regime and racially prejudiced beliefs, regardless of whether or not it's observably or empirically true. Society already possesses the psychological techniques needed to obtain the universal observance of a code that would guarantee the success of a community or state. The difficulty is that these techniques are in the hands of the wrong people, or rather, there aren't any right people. That's what he ruefully observed. This is B.F. Skinner now. Prior to 1962, the year that Jan van Riebeeck landed at the Cape, a white ethnic group like the Afrikaners didn't exist. Arguably, the Afrikaners were as much a white supremacist social construction as the existence of a separate black ethnic group we now know today as the colored people of the Western Cape. Let's look at how this ragtag bunch of immigrant Europeans invented a separate ethnic identity for themselves, hijacked a country bigger than the land surface of Egypt, that they were going to dominate at the explicit expense of the indigenous tribes by providing all Afrikaners with jobs, with some explicitly enabled to amass generational fortunes in the process. The Afrikaners are the largest white ethnic group in Africa, numbering around 2.8 million. They are descendants of the mainly 17th century Dutch, German and French settlers in South Africa. These are the formative events that led us to today. It was the arrival of the French Huguenots, a persecuted minority Protestant group who fled France after the Edict of Fontainebleau, otherwise known as the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, on the 22nd of October 1685, which would eventually give the pursuit of a separate ethnic identity a massive impetus that is still felt today. See, the Huguenots were provided with free passage to South Africa and were encouraged to farm in the Western Cape area. They were given assistance with their homes, loans for land and farming equipment by the Dutch East India Company. And to put the organization in perspective, the DEIC, better known as the VOC, was the world's first multinational company listed on the first modern-day bourse or stock exchange, which acted on behalf of the Dutch government. This was a terrifying precursor to today's corporate empire, employing more than 100,000 employees worldwide. They could own their own colonies. They boasted their own private army and naval fleet. Adjusted for inflation in today's terms, the DEIC would be worth an estimated $7.8 trillion, which effectively makes it more valuable than Apple several times over. Now, the much persecuted and battle-hardened French Huguenots brought a rigid Calvinistic zeal, still evident today, a deliberate white ethnic chauvinism, and a thuggish nationalist spirit and grit to South Africa in pursuit of the adoption of their new country. They would willingly lose their language, traditions and culture in the process of complete integration into their new home, South Africa. So at the Treaty of Vereniging at the close of the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1902, the Afrikaner generals Christian de Wet, Louis Botha, Jan Smuts and Koos de la Rey, amongst others, won a type of semi-autonomy for the Free State and Transvaal, the right to private property, the right to own their own guns again, and more importantly, compensation for the war, right? But lost the newly discovered gold fields of the Witwatersrand. But it was the compensation provided by Lord Kitchener, who initially committed to paying £3 million at the time, but ended up paying £16 million. This provided the Afrikaner farming communities with a massive financial boost they needed and is still felt today. Adjusted for inflation and at a mean exchange rate with a presumption of a 6% average Dow Jones ROI, or return on investment, works up to a staggering 8.5 billion rands, folks. Kitchener also provided the Afrikaner farmers with farming equipment, stock, feed and seeds, and even veterinary services. Just for a moment, imagine that black people were awarded a similar amount in apartheid reparations and the theft of their lands. There's no doubt, by the account of most scholars of history, that the Carnegie Institute study of the poor white problem in the 1930s in South Africa. The findings of the researchers helped lay the blueprint for apartheid. According to one memorandum sent through to Freddie Keppel, the then president of Carnegie, there was little doubt that if the natives, which is the black and brown people, were given full economic opportunity, the more competent among them would soon outstrip the less competent whites. Thus, informal apartheid was born. The Carnegie report results would eventually be translated into job reservation for white people, and thus white privilege for the first time was institutionalized through economic apartheid legislation. For example, the Mine and Workers Act No. 12 of 1911, the Minimum Wages Act of 1925, the Mines and Workers Act of 1926, the Bantu Builders Working Act of No. 27 of 1951, and the Industrial Conciliation Amendment Act of 1956. It was the creation of Young Zuid-Afrika, in English Young South Africa, which became the Broederbond in 1920, a shadowy, secretive, fascist, chauvinist, white supremacist group with the sole aim of achieving Afrikaner dominion over South Africa. In other words, it was the Afrikaner that first invented, arguably, the deep state. In a word, the power behind the powerful. It had the single most profound effect on Afrikaner identity, Afrikaner nationalism, Afrikaner solidarity, Afrikaner social, political, commercial influence, and eventually culminated in the Afrikaner win in the 1948 general election in apartheid, in South Africa, I beg your pardon, barely 30 years later. That was the creation of a literal organization, a company of astute, committed, single-minded, and influential Afrikaner individuals. The invention, in effect, of a South African mafia-like organization. The Afrikaner Broederbond with the same goals and purposes as was the creation of the 19th century Italian mafia, otherwise known as La Cosa Nostra, was the eventual ownership, control, and domination of the South African nation-state for the accumulation of power and legislated access to all its resources by any legal means or other. The election victory of 1948 was an important milestone for the Afrikaner in that they could immediately fulfill the aims, ambitions and objectives of the Broederbond and define their own destiny, because for the very first time in their history, they now owned a country. One has to ask the question why the Afrikaner chose the ideology of white supremacy. Firstly, they believe themselves to be the Israelites of Africa, surrounded as it were by the brutality of the Philistines on all sides. The ideology of white supremacy facilitated the acquisition of hegemonic power, theft of natural resources and property on an unimaginable scale. You see, since time immemorial, all ruling classes had an ideology that they used on the masses. Typically, the neocons in Washington and the global power elite use neoliberalism today as their ideology to justify neo-capitalism. In addition, being the only white-ruled country outside of America, Europe, and Oceania, and the only white minority-ruled country in the world, no other white Western government would interfere with the treatment of the natives because institutionalized and systemic globalized white supremacy deemed the natives expendable. The 1948 victory gave the Afrikaner access to the levers of government lawmaking, so they went about reinventing South Africa in their own image and likeness, enacting the most comprehensive body of more than 2,000 explicitly racist laws, statutes and ordinances that promoted white over black in all areas of human endeavors, turning South Africa into the world's most perfect system of white supremacy and racism ever known. Indeed, South Africa became the world's open market for every hustler, charlatan, huckster, barrow boy, conman, international crook, arms and drug dealers, tricksters, miscreants, and every shade of social deviant imaginable, as long as you were white. Right? Your skin color was unashamedly legal tender and guaranteed you a good enough job, a company car, easy bank loans, and a house in Johannesburg, vast East Rand, a thriving middle-class community. Fact is, a foreign passport actually increased your allure with the local white female population, who were often easily duped by tall tales on account of their strict Calvinistic upbringing and lack of worldliness. So complete was their imprimatur on the South African landscape that every single small town in South Africa has a Voortrekker street, mythologizing the early Voortrekkers' valiant struggles to arrive in the promised land. The country is so replete, its landscape so saturated with Afrikaner symbolism that it'll take years, if that, to remove them all. The oft-ignored fact is that victory in 1948 importantly gave them access to the country's central bank situated in Pretoria, the South African Reserve Bank, and this meant that they could for the very first time print their own money as they wished, start their own banks, issue government bonds and treasury bills, guaranteeing it through the central bank, round-tripping it through the national treasury because that's how money is created, and thus have the power to create their own wealth. This fact should not be ignored, folks, as it provides any government with both the power to create money, but also automatically backed by big business or the corporate elite because they purchase government bonds. Roughly 40% of trade on all the bourses worldwide is government stocks and bonds. and of course treasury bills, I beg your pardon, thus giving it the legitimacy. This simply means that they can stay in power for an interminable period if they so wished, and goodness did they try. Afrikaner nationalist accomplishments during their rule in South Africa. In pursuit of the objectives of complete hegemony, they created a number of banks as follows: Trust Bank, United Building Society, Volkskas Bank, literally meaning the nation's treasure, Boland Bank, Allied Bank, Cent Bank, Bankfin. These banks have merged in 1991 and now operate as a new banking consortium known as Absa Limited, or Amalgamated Banks of South Africa, $1 billion banking enterprises that today operates in more than a dozen African countries. An equally important order of business post the election victory in 1948 was to, in effect, threaten the English business elite with nationalization, just like what the ANC attempted to achieve right when they came into power, who then quickly relented and offered a substantial portion of Anglo-America at below market value to appease the new political mandarins in Pretoria. Now, heavy government backing saw the organization over the following decades turn into the second largest resource multinational on the planet. The company is called BHP Billiton, simultaneously listed in Sydney, London, New York and Johannesburg, and today is worth a reported $70 billion. Part of the Afrikaner strategy was employment for all its members, and that would be natural. And they knew that any government is always the largest employer, so they went about creating 24 multi-million state-owned enterprises: ISCOR, the Land Bank of South Africa, Development Bank of South Africa, Telkom, the Industrial Development Corporation, Armscor, Sasol Limited, Transnet, South African Airways, and Alexcor, to name but a few. But it provided skills development, guaranteed long-term employment, and contributed to the rapidly growing Afrikaner middle class. No more will they experience the deprivations and humiliations of the 1930s, because they had the most important weapon in their hands. They controlled the levers of economic power. So contrary to the most earnest protestations by the time the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, arrived, one would have thought that not one financial institution supported the regime. But of course the opposite is true. Historically, all big business operates symbiotically within a tyrannical environment. For example, notwithstanding the Cold War, most of Europe, and indeed its NATO members, purchased their gas from the old Soviet Union. In addition, Rolls-Royce of England had no problem supplying the Russians with both jet engines and the technologies for their long-range bombers. Evidently, business is still business. The outstanding legacy of apartheid as of today. Let's examine that for a moment. A new report from the World Bank finds that the top 1% of South African owns 70.9% of the nation's wealth, whilst the bottom 60% of South Africans collectively control only 7% of the country's assets. In a 2018 report, number one, on average, white South Africans still earn 6 times more than black people today. In the 1960s, the ratio was 13-1. Number two, more than 67% of the land mass in South Africa is still owned by white capital, whether privately through corporations or trusts, or as usual, a complex network of cleverly disguised offshore entities. Number three, according to a government land audit on the Deeds Office data released in February 2018, SA has 419,005 farms at an average of 254 hectares each. 99% of them are white owned. Number four, a CIPC report of 2018, that is the Companies and Intellectual Properties Commission, indicates that South Africa has a total of 16.2 million registrations, which consists of registrations of all types of juristic entities, patents and copyrights. Number five, as of July 2019, there are approximately 4,500 companies listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the largest exchange in Africa, with a total capitalization in excess of $1 trillion, or just over 15 trillion rands. Number six, it is estimated that more than 3 trillion rand was funneled into offshore accounts after the collapse of the financial rand, a clever financial instrument that allowed well-connected savvy white businessmen to make a quick profit through the practice, again, of round-tripping, using normal rands to purchase the South African rands, then waiting for a favorable exchange rate in order to reverse the transaction, sell the financial rands again, and of course, declare a healthy profit. An NEF, or National Empowerment Fund report of 2015 estimates that 93% of the shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is owned by white people and white-owned and controlled corporations and institutions, 25 years after the collapse of apartheid. So let's look at the psychosocial and therefore the psychohistorical manipulation of the ordinary Afrikaner folk. It must be noted that history is replete with the manipulation by the political, intellectual and corporate elite of the ordinary people through symbolism, a common culture narrative, an appeal to tribal chauvinism, false beliefs in exceptionalism, America would be an example of that, manufactured histories, and the divine destiny trope, often eloquently appropriated from the Bible. Hitler, the Nazis, and of course the Americans are the most recent examples of this damaging pathology. Join us next week on Wade's World for Chapter 2, and please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel and leave a comment if you wish, folks. Just remember, thinking is living. Until next time, thank you.